I'm Catherine Maxwell and I'm the General Manager of Policy and Advocacy at the Governance Institute of Australia. And I'm going to be talking to Daniel Popovski, Senior Policy Advisor and AI Policy Lead at Governance Institute of Australia, about developing an AI governance policy. So certainly Governance Institute's been doing a lot of policy work around AI, produced quite a number of documents, and we did a report on AI implementation and adoption by companies and organisations last year. And as an organisation, Governance Institute wants to use AI to increase our productivity and take advantage of some of the benefits that certainly a smaller organisation could take up by using AI. And there's a lot of hype around AI. And the other thing we know, just from talking to people and certainly from some of the work we've done, is that there are lots of people in organisations who are using AI without a governance framework in place. And so when Governance Institute started thinking about using AI in the workplace, Dan was like, we need an AI governance policy. So what we're going to do is talk about our journey to develop an AI governance policy, and also to sort of about some of the things that you might want to think about in terms of developing an AI governance policy. So Dan, I guess, what's the purpose and importance placed on having an AI policy in the workplace?
Well, I guess first of all, Catherine, it's really about setting the tone of how you wish to use AI across the organisation. And that really is a critical first step in developing staff and developing up AI softwares across the organisation. The critical first step is then setting up an AI policy. And with that comes a number of questions. First, the duties and responsibilities of staff or the organisation as a whole, and also looking at the differences between employees and senior managers as well, and really delineating kind of the types of responsibilities and the types of duties they own and they actually have. And with that comes a number of things. Understanding their key responsibilities means that managers need to work through a number of requirements with their staff to ensure that they understand and they're empowered to use the technology in a purposeful way. And often that comes through understanding processes that may require AI technologies and those that probably don't. So really understanding in the first instance where AI can be used, where it can't be used, and then making that clear through an AI policy. But really, essentially, it should set the tone for how the organisation wants AI to be used, and it should give those very clear lines of responsibility to managers, employees, and the organisation as a whole.
Because what you really don't want is this whole shadow use of AI in an organisation, because there are a lot of potential dangers around that.
This may occur in organisations where people feel comfortable using things like ChatGPT with their mobile phones, and they think it's okay. That may actually trigger a number of issues such as privacy and safety and security of data, particularly where there's sensitive information involved. It's really important that staff are aware that they need to understand where the data sits and where the data is being used. And so if you throw up a whole bunch of information on a non-enterprise level software, that data may fly around somewhere and end up in the hands of a malicious actor. So there is an intertwining issue there around AI, but also cyber policy as well.
Yeah.
And there's also the issue around understanding data, privacy protections. And I think that's a really core point of establishing an AI policy, to understand where those lines of responsibilities are, what's allowed, what's not allowed, and then empowering employees to take initiative and take steps to actually roll out AI in a purposeful way.
There's lots of stuff out there. I know just from our day jobs, we are constantly bombarded with stuff about AI. Where did you find was a good place to start?
Well, in developing the AI policy, the first place I started was looking at the National AI Centre's resources that are online. They've done a fantastic job in terms of pulling together information about the essential practices that organisational leaders should be thinking about and taking across their journey. And that starts with both those that are kind of beginning out their journey and those that are a little bit more sophisticated. And essentially that pulls in a number of things, one being the ethical principles that underlie a lot of the ways that AI is being used. So for instance, is it fair? Is it accountable? Is it transparent? And those principles are really important to kind of drive the implementation practices. So they've done a really good job with that. And also looking at...
And actually, we're one of their knowledge partners. So
we're a strategic knowledge partner.
So that's been a great collaboration.
Yeah, they've worked with us on a number of initiatives, including a number of reports. And what we found with our members is that their tools are quite useful just in terms of actually implementing and deploying. So it's not just those kind of principles that sit nonsensically somewhere. They actually do provide a stepping stone into actually deploying and implementing AI. So I would start with them. There's also a wonderful range of resources by the National Institute of Science and Technology, which sits in the US.
NIST. Is that NIST? Yeah.
So the NIST AI management framework is a really good framework about thinking about internal and external stakeholders, and perhaps even thinking about broader impacts to society and customers and the community. So that's a really fantastic framework to think about. And then there's international standards. So you've got the International Standards Organization that's developed AI management systems frameworks. And we've got that through the Australian standard ISO 42001. Again, that's a very complementary tool to existing standards around risk management and cybersecurity. So it's a really good way to actually pull things together and develop an AI policy and governance framework.
So there are places to start.
Yeah.
So and you've actually tested them out and found that they were pretty good and pretty useful.
Correct, yeah. So in developing our AI policy, what I've done is actually drawn in some of those implementation practices. And the key step there is really customizing it to your organization. You can have very complex organizations that require a different level and a different understanding of AI tools and implementation practices. But you really need to be able to customize it for your own purposes and own needs. And really what this AI policy does is it empowers managers to take the first step to have those conversations with their staff, with their team, to determine how and where they can actually use it. A core issue that we've come up with, and a lot of reports have come through, is that people are using AI without testing the kind of return on investment. They're not thinking about the business value proposition.
They're getting sidetracked.
They're getting sidetracked by
the glamour of a new technology.
Correct. And they're looking at, things like, FOMO, am I missing out on this new technology? Do I need to jump in first? Well, you should kind of start with the value proposition and really testing where the value lies. There might be AI technologies that create a huge amount of value. And that's something that I think a team can work towards trialing, testing, screening, and then deploying at scale.
The policy you've drafted talks about ethical dilemmas that might arise from the use of AI in workplace settings. So how can organisations support, safe and responsible use of AI?
Bringing it back to those essential ethical principles, I think one example is fairness. So really thinking about whether the AI tool is being used in a fair and impartial way. So for an example, if we have a HR recruitment agency that's now going through and testing resumes, is it fairly screening those resumes, and does it actually trigger other legal requirements such as the Disability Discrimination Act or the Racial Discrimination Act that may actually trigger some concern? So there are tangential laws and policies that need to interact, and you need to think about when deploying the AI policy. In those sorts of instances, fairness kind of sits as this policy principle, but in practice, it actually can impact the organization holistically, and it can trigger a number of different legal risks and concerns. So kind of going through those key principles such as fairness, accountability, kind of really grappling and understanding, contemplating those concepts deeply will ensure that the AI policy is really well-rounded and rigorous and really meets the needs of the organization.
Obviously, using AI can really interact with the legal obligations and responsibilities, particularly for senior officers and directors. So, what are some of the potential consequences if there are problems?
With senior directors and non-executive directors, for instance, the director duties and, senior officers in general, I think that's a really core component. So really understanding where AI sits in the organization, so kind of auditing where decisions are made is one critical aspect of kind of understanding your governance role. And so if AI systems are being deployed in areas where key decisions are being made that could be financial in nature or non-financial, but really important, they're the sorts of things that we need to contemplate to ensure that we actually, as directors, are fulfilling the duties. Yeah.
But also, we're not asking them to go down and test everything, but we are saying, this is part of your oversight.
Correct, yeah. So, for instance, if there's a new financial system that makes or automates payments, are those payments is there a human in the loop, for instance, and is there someone that's actually signing off on those dotted lines where it matters? I think you can have AI assist you where that administrative burden may lie, but then those key decision points and where final approval is required, it's really important that we have key decision makers that are in that decision-making
So that
process.
human in the loop.
Yeah.
What do you think is the most challenging policy principle to implement?
I think for the most challenging, it would probably be transparency and explainability. Okay. And there's a number of reasons for that. I think with explainability, it's really hard to take some of the actions of an AI system, particularly the black box thinking, and convey that into a way that a customer or a supplier or even a regulatory agency would understand. So it's really important that organizations have an AI register and they actually think about how those AI decisions are being made and how they can actually communicate both to internal and external stakeholders. That's a real challenge. It's a really important challenge. And I think for organizations thinking about that, they really struggle with the explainability, only because the explainability can be quite challenging when the technical complexities behind the scenes and there's no way of actually understanding how the AI is actually working. So I think that's a really core challenge, but it's something that is really critical just in terms of if a regulatory agency asks for that information, having that available is really crucial.
I suppose the second part of the policy introduces us to responsible adoption and deployment. How does that work?
So there are a number of things you could do as a manager. For instance, a screening, monitoring and testing process. So we often encourage our members or anyone that we speak to really test and learn from experimenting. And closed environments are really good ways of actually checking to see if that particular AI model or system that you're using is actually useful and purposeful and is leading to the appropriate outcomes. And often that includes testing the veracity of what the AI model is actually doing and ensuring it has the integrity to repeat its own actions again and again. And where there's drift, for instance, it gives us and allows us an opportunity to monitor, test, and kind of shift the way that the AI system is now being able to, produce the results that it needs to produce. So that testing, monitoring is really important. The other is having an AI governance owner. So knowing who the AI governance owner is in the organization could be really important in actually triggering some privacy or security risk that you may be contemplating and not sure how to kind of respond to. Throw it to an AI governance owner, but make sure that you understand and know who that person is.
So chicken or egg, what comes first, AI policy or a governance framework?
They're both complementary. I would say that AI policy is probably, a crucial first step. So really just laying those foundations and guardrails around key responsibilities and also thinking about who and where the responsibility lies. Testing and learning is also part of that policy. So I think the policy is really important. And then from there, where you've implemented enterprise level AI, I think that's where a governance framework really kind of cements and makes that, transforms the AI policy into a real actionable governance framework. So I think the governance framework really comes after you've kind of tested and learned playing around with the policy and also playing around with the technology.
Some really good insights about places to start. So, Dan, thanks for your time.
Thank you.
We're going to talk today about some recently released principles of good practices in relation to confidential information. And I'm going to have a chat with Ian Matheson, CEO of the Australasian Investor Relations Association, who are the co-authors of this publication. We have a number of listed company secretaries who are members of Governance Institute, and Ian's members are typically investor relations professionals, and they work very closely together in organisations. And the handling of confidential information is a big concern for both of them. ERA and Governance Institute have a long history of collaboration on a whole range of issues, like confidential information, annual general meetings, disclosure, and improving ways of working in companies. And certainly companies worry a lot about continuous disclosure. In the last couple of years, we've seen ASIC have some successful actions against companies There was a $15 million fine in relation to Get Swift, and ANZ also had proceedings against it in relation to a $2.5 billion institutional share placement. So we released our principles originally in 2014, but we've revised them and re-released them in the last couple of weeks. And I'd certainly, on behalf of both Ian and I, like to thank Priscilla Bryan of Herbert Smith Freehills and her team for their assistance in making sure that the publication reflects the law. So, Ian, welcome.
Thanks very much, Catherine. Another great collaboration between ERA and GIA, and perhaps for some further context to your introductory remarks, the chairman of ASIC, Joe Longo, or current chair of ASIC, Joe Longo, said last year that that ASIC was concerned about the number of leaks that are particularly around transactions, although not exclusively around leaks around transactions, but other leaks around continuous disclosure related matters as well, such as upgrades and downgrades, for example. And I think the reality is that this is still a concern, and the company may not be the source of the leak, but it behoves any listed entity to manage their own continuous disclosure obligations. And therefore, it's the responsibility ultimately of the issuer to make sure that to the greatest extent possible that they avoid leaks. And that means inevitably leads to the need to properly manage this process, where in the case of a transaction, there might be a deal team where there might be, potentially be dozens of people involved, and how important it is that everyone is working on the transaction is signed up through a confidentiality agreement, signed up to an NDA, so that the information through the life of the transaction remains confidential and therefore doesn't breach the company's continuous disclosure obligations. Why did we being GIA and ERA, revise the document and the principles to a second edition? It is because there are still too many leaks. And but secondly, it is important for listeners to this vodcast to understand that the principles do apply not just to transactions such as mergers and acquisitions, but also to many other continuous disclosure related situations, as I've already mentioned, the upgrades and downgrades, which are more about managing information internally. So, Catherine, more specifically, tell us some of the major changes in the second edition.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, number one, we've made it easier to read. We've made the language more direct and a bit more contemporary, because when I looked at it again, I was like, oh, okay, things have changed a bit. It now includes a summary of the legal framework, so that you've got that at the beginning of the document, so you sort of know where you are in terms of the law, and we've made sure that it reflects the current law. I think the other thing that we've done is really emphasised confidentiality protocols and just how you handle confidential information. And I think the world has changed in terms of technology when I looked at something. So 2014 doesn't seem that long ago, but in fact it's a bit of a world away in terms of how we deal with things. Doesn't really talk about faxes anymore. Document rooms are more likely to be online these days. For example, there's references to mobile technology. So everybody uses mobile technology now. And we've updated a lot of the references and suggestions. For example, it suggests that laptops lock automatically, so that that's just something you have in place in the organisation when you're not using them. Talks about cybersecurity, and also is really a reminder to limit the use of AI when you're working on these sorts of transactions. There's an extended discussion of leaks, as well as the section on third-party confidentiality agreements. We might come back to that a bit later. Discussion of the reputation and front page tests. Do you want to see this on the front page or in Rear Window is the other place it might be. And we've also maintained the checklist, which I think is just a useful reminder of some of the things you need to do. So I guess, Ian, what do you think some of the really key points to remember might be?
First and possibly foremost, that leaks can be a regular occurrence. You can't rule them out permanently, but you've got to be prepared for them. And that's what these principles really emphasise, is being prepared in the event that an entity there is a leak around a transaction particularly. So that means things like being prepared, having a draft release,
Yep.
ASX release that can be used, shortly thereafter. I suppose that just in terms of an issuer managing its continuous disclosure obligations, having draft releases for a number of different situations, including leaks, is just, paramount.
Yeah.
But also being aware that leaks can often occur when you least expect them, and hence the need to have a draft prepared, ready to go soon thereafter in the event that there is a leak in the media.
On a Sunday night at 6:00, yeah.
But also to remind listeners that based on my conversations with journalists over the years, leaks often come from people outside the company. Might be advisors, or they might be spoilers on the other side of the transaction as well, and who want to sort of flush out a potential transaction, and it therefore loses the confidentiality as far as the stock exchange are concerned. And a company then has to respond. And there's nothing more embarrassing really for a company who, in that situation where there is a leak, it looks like the company hasn't managed its disclosure obligations appropriately. And
the consequences are quite serious potentially.
Yeah. And there's nothing worse than for an issuer getting an aware letter from the stock exchange, and with all the sort of time and effort that goes into having to respond to that, and potentially not derailing a transaction, but it may throw a spanner in the works and may lead to repricing of a deal. There's all sorts of implications of leaks.
Trading halt, which is not a great time if you're in the middle of a transaction, having a trading halt.
Yeah. I suppose just to also to reinforce the point about that these principles are not just for M&A transactions.
Yeah.
They're for almost sort of day-to-day continuous disclosure obligations and managing confidential information within a company. And as listeners would, I'm sure, be aware that there are many people internally within a company who, as information evolves and matures and ultimately sort of finds its way up to the disclosure committee for consideration, there's potentially a lot of fingers and that information can go through. And on the way, it's really, really important for those who manage the company's disclosure obligations, i.e. COSEC and investor relations, to ensure that all those people who are involved in that maturing process of information and down in the businesses potentially, that they are aware of their own personal disclosure obligations and also the importance of confidentiality. And you don't talk to friends and family. You don't
have a conversation in the gym like one I heard the other night, or at the airport in a cafe.
Yeah, leaving your laptop open in the airport lounge, for example, or just the pub talk, which the old loose lips sink ships principle is so true, that you never know who's listening to conversations. You might actually be a competitor in the chair next door if you're sitting on the plane, or in the pub listening to overhearing a conversation. It's really important for issuers and all those who are involved in handling confidential information just to be aware of the issuer's responsibilities in terms of managing the company's disclosure obligations, but also personally what individuals' own personal responsibilities are around protecting the company's confidential information, and being aware of if an individual is the source of that leak, or even worse, trades on that information, which may be inside information. There are severe penalties for insider trading for individuals who are in receipt of that information.
And actually, one of the things the document contains is a bit of a list of things to think about when you're putting together a confidentiality agreement. So that's just goes through some of those and just sort of, but I think that whole education and training piece is very important as well.
Yeah.
Make sure that you do have a process for training people and reminding them of their confidentiality obligations. and that the consequences are potentially dismissal. I mean, a good confidentiality agreement will cover the fact that if this happens, you are likely to lose your job, not to mention face more serious consequences if ASIC decides to take proceedings.
In closing, perhaps just a couple of sort of key reminders to members of our respective organisations, how important it is for an entity to keep its disclosure policy up to date, which includes, the day-to-day management of confidential information, but also as part of that disclosure policy, ensuring that, those who are working on transactions are subject to non-disclosure agreements, and that includes external advisors as well, and also to not just train people on reminding them of those obligations, but also perhaps to train as part of a potential crisis situation as well,
where
that's
a good one.
Breach of continuous disclosure might ultimately lead to a sort of crisis type situation, and how important it is to have draft ASX releases ready to go to cover all the bases in terms of potential situations, that if there are transactions on foot, what some of the potential situations might be if there are leaks.
No, absolutely. And I think if you're updating your continuous disclosure policy, have a look at this document just to make sure that you've sort of covered off on all the issues that you might need to think about. Ian, thank you. That's been a really great discussion. If you'd like to have a look at the principles, you can download them from the Member Resources section of the Governance Institute and also from the ERA website. Thank you so much.